Vanakkam. Welcome to this video on biomechanics. We have been looking at the upper limb. Specifically in this class, we will be looking at the biomechanics of upper limb actions or motion. More specifically, in this video, we will be looking at muscles of the elbow joint and how these muscles cause movements at the elbow joint. Let's move forward. So, the elbow joint is this joint that is formed by the long thin bone of the upper arm called as a humerus. The bone underlying the upper arm is called humerus. And the two bones that form the forearm, which is the radius and ulna. Radius is on the thumb side, ulna on the little finger side. These two things, radius, ulna, humerus. Right. Since there are three bones that are involved, essentially there are three joints that are possible. One is the joint between the radius and ulna at the proximal end, radius ulna joint at the proximal side, then the joint between the radius and humerus, and then the joint between the ulna and the humerus. These are the three possibilities. So, which one of these constitutes the elbow joint? By the way, let us remember the elbow joint has a single degree of freedom, right? That is, it is a hinge joint. It has only 1 degree of freedom. This movement is called flexion and extension. So, there are these three joints: radiohumeral joint, ulnohumeral joint and proximal radial ulnar joint. Remember, radius and ulna are like this. So, this is say the radius and there is one more bone, this is the ulna, and they both not like that. So, there are two joints, proximal, distal. The joint on the proximal side, the radio-ulnar joint on the proximal side appears near the elbow. The one that is on the distal side appears near the wrist. Right. In general, when we say the elbow joint, we usually refer to this humero-ulnar joint or ulnohumeral joint. This is what is commonly referred to as the elbow joint. So, whenever someone says elbow joint, this is the joint that they are referring to. So, this is the humerus, this is the ulna, and this is the radius. Remember, there is also this is the proximal radio-ulnar joint. This is the proximal radio-ulnar joint. This is the ulnar humerus joint. This is what is generally called as the elbow joint. This is the elbow joint as it is called. So, what are the muscles that are responsible for the motion at the upper limb, specifically the elbow joint? So, these muscles are located in the upper arm to start with. So, biceps, shortly called as biceps, has two heads, technically called as biceps brachii. Biceps brachii has two heads, a short head and a long head. And then there is a muscle called triceps, generally called triceps, but technically called triceps brachii. Then there is this brachioradialis. There is the brachialis, not shown in this picture. And then there are muscles in the forearm or the lower arm. These are flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, flexor carpi ulnaris, flexor digitorum superficialis, and then there is the pronator teres. We will not be looking at the origin, insertion and action of all these muscles, we will take the most prominent muscles among these and discuss their origin, insertion and action at some level of detail. So, let us look at the major flexor of the elbow joint, which is biceps brachii. The short head attaches to the coracoid process, which is forming or nearly forming the part of the shoulder. It's quite close to the shoulder, right? And the long head attaches to the glenoid tubercle of the scapula, again part of the complex system of articulations that together form what is called as the shoulder, right. The insertion is on the back side, posterior part of the radial tuberosity. So, the attachment is somewhere posterior side, which is here, on the radial tuberosity, somewhere here is where you are looking at, right. Major action is to supinate the elbow joint or supinate the arm. Remember, supination is this configuration in which you can hold a bowl or you can hold a soup, supination. So, when the arm is like this, to do this you need to supinate. The other is flexion, flexor of the elbow. Now, a question is, if one muscle has two functions, why is it that at any given point in time either I supinate or I flex? Suppose I want to do only one of these two actions, I am able to do it. If this muscle is responsible, it is not like when I am flexing I am always supinating, I can also do that. It is pronated and I can also do that, and I can also, I can simply do this without flexing. It seems like an amount of independence is achieved, but how? Is a question that I will let you think for some time. So, you can think about this. Why is it that I am able to independently perform supination and flexion of the elbow joint, although the same muscle is responsible for these two functions? Think about that. We will come back to that in a future video, right. So, then there is the brachialis. Brachialis, is on the anteromedial and anterolateral surface of the lower half of the shaft of the humerus. So, anteromedial, anterolateral, lateral means on the side, medial is towards the midline, antero means on the front side, right, of the lower half of the shaft of the humerus, somewhere here is where you are looking at. And the insertion is closer to the ulnar tuberosity. Again, same function, elbow flexion. So, then you have the triceps brachii, which is a major extensor of the elbow joint. Right. Its long head is on the infraglenoid tubercle of the scapula and on the posterior side, right. So, on the posterior side means here, closer to here, right. This is the muscle that comes, and then it attaches on the posterior surface of the olecranon process of the ulna, somewhere here is where this attachment is. So, if this muscle contracts, you are going to have, so this part is going to contract and then the elbow joint is going to extend, right. So, that is the reason that these muscles essentially almost fully located on the posterior side, right. Then you have the brachioradialis. This is again a flexor of the elbow joint. What are the other two flexors that we saw that are responsible for flexion at the elbow joint? One is biceps brachii, the other is brachialis. Then you have the brachioradialis. This is, origin, it has its origin in the upper two-third of the lateral supracondylar ridge. And remember, from the name I can guess that it is attaching the radius, right? Base of the styloid process of the radius responsible for flexion of the elbow joint. So, there are indeed 3 flexors of the elbow joint, right. Then what other muscles? Then you have muscles that are located across the elbow joint, but do not necessarily play a role in the action or movement of the elbow joint. Also, one more thing to note is that some of these muscles like the flexors and extensors also help in stabilizing the shoulder joint by keeping the shoulder in its place. So, some of them are responsible for that. Some muscles whose bodies are present across the elbow joint, particularly whose origin is in the upper arm, but whose function may not necessarily involve the movement of the elbow joint. We are classifying them as elbow joint because they cross the elbow joint. They do not necessarily play a role in movement or action of the elbow joint, right. One is the flexor carpi radialis muscle. This is responsible for flexion of the wrist for that action, right. Medial epicondyle of the humerus, antebrachial fascia and intermuscular septa. Okay. So it is a muscle that originates in the upper arm and it inserts into the metacarpal bones somewhere here, relatively long muscle. So, insertion is on the metacarpal bones. This is responsible for flexion of the wrist, right. Palmar surface of the metacarpal bones, not on the back side. So, this is the dorsal surface, the posterior surface, right. So, on the anterior surface or on the palmar surface is where you are going to have that, because that makes sense, right. So, because if this muscle is contracting, right, so the muscle starts here and it sends its tendons like that, and if this muscle is contracting, the arm is going to get, the hand is going to get pulled like this. This is the action that is called as wrist flexion. Then you have flexor carpi ulnaris. This has 2 things, right, 2 functions. One is flexion of the wrist joint, the other is adduction of the wrist joint. But what exactly is this action? This is, we mentioned this is abduction, it is also called as radial deviation, but in general we prefer to use, instead of adduction, ulnar deviation, right? Not. That makes sense because this is a muscle that attaches across the ulna, right. So, the humeral origin is at the medial epicondyle, the ulnar origin is at the medial margin of the olecranon process. So, you know it starts here, right. So, this is the flexor carpi ulnaris muscle, right. The attachment is in the 5th metacarpal and the pisiform hook of the hamate bones, which is a bone in the hand, right, responsible for the wrist flexion and ulnar deviation. Okay. Then you have flexor digitorum, right. There are 2-3 types of these, flexor digitorum superficialis, flexor digitorum profundus, etc. Right. So, this sends 4 tendons. Okay. So, there are 4 tendons that get attached to the base of the proximal phalanx. This is the proximal phalanx, the segment of the finger that is closest to the palm is called as the proximal segment or the proximal phalanx, right. Then it splits into two and then reunites to the sides of the shaft of the middle phalanx. This is the intermediate phalanx. The segment in the middle of the finger is called as the intermediate phalanx or the middle phalanx of the 4 digits, right. These 4 digits, it attaches and reunites and then attaches here. Because of this reason, when this tendon moves, you are able to perform that action. This is the flexion of the middle phalanx at the proximal interphalangeal joint. The joint that is found or that is formed between two phalanges is called as the interphalangeal joint, and that interphalangeal joint that is on the proximal side is called as the proximal interphalangeal joint, and that interphalangeal joint that is on the distal side is called as a distal interphalangeal joint, sometimes called shortly as pip joint and dip joint. These are the pip joints, these are the dip joints, right. These are formed within the finger. So, flexion of the middle phalanx by moving the pip joint, proximal interphalangeal joint. Then what do we have? So, let us look at these movements at the elbow joint. You have this flexion. So, you have this flexion extension of the elbow joint, and then supination, pronation, right. So, essentially at the elbow joint, when we are discussing, we are interested in supination and flexion extension. These are the movements. Pronation and supination are not exactly movements of the elbow, they are produced at the nearby radio-ulnar joint. Remember, elbow joint refers to the humero-ulnar joint, but then again, this movement is a relative movement of radius and ulna, right, a rotation of the radius and ulna, that is called as the radio-ulnar joint, right. So, with this we come to the end of this video. In this video, we looked at the various muscles that form or that cross the elbow joint and the specific movements that these muscles contribute to. Thank you very much for your attention.